I've been asked to tell you that if you didn't have an opportunity to pick up your Shield of David card, they're at the greeters table and you can pick it up on your way out. I like to go running in the morning, and before I start my route, I have an important decision to make. What will I listen to along the way? Some mornings I choose the news and I switch back and forth between Fox and NPR. I do. But other mornings I'm just not up for hearing what has happened in the world. And instead I choose podcasts of poetry or Torah or perhaps beautiful music to listen to. It really changes the tone of my day depending on that decision that I make. If I choose the news, then I end up feeling informed and a little bit revved up and ready to go make the world a better place. But when I choose poetry or Torah or music, I begin my day in a calm and centered way. And really, both of these are good things. The world is brutal. Hurricanes, earthquakes, political divisions, rises in hate crimes. And we get to choose how we respond to it. And I would say that it's somewhat like my choice in what I listen to on my run. There are moments where we need to choose to engage with every fiber of our being and fight for what's right and relieve those that are suffering. And there are other moments where, at least temporarily, we need to choose to withdraw and replenish ourselves. So this will be a two-part sermon. The first half will be given today, and the second half will be given on Yom Kippur. And today I will discuss how do we retreat temporarily, and on Yom Kippur I will talk how do we fight the good fight. I'm going to make three arguments in favor of keeping the Sabbath, of honoring Shabbat. The first is that it will replenish our mind, body, and soul. The second is that it is an expression of Jewish pride in a time of anti-Semitism. And the third is that it's a good reminder for those of us who feel that we have to save the entire planet single-handedly, that we are not completely in control. This idea of taking time out to restore ourselves has gotten some notice. They call it unplugging in the secular world. Here is a quote or two from an article that the LA Times published in the last few months. I'm a media entrepreneur. I was working 7 days a week and going through a lot of burnout, says Dan Rollman, the chief executive of RecordSetter.com. So he came up with a manifesto whose 10 points include avoiding technology and commerce, giving back, and getting outside. The people I work with now know I have a day off, and I'm not really going to work. And ultimately, it adds up to me becoming a more productive, happy, and balanced person. Dr. David Spiegel, director of Stanford's Center on Stress and Health, says, our bodies and brains are designed to take a rest, and they don't work well if we don't. Insomnia, infertility, weight gain, alertness issues, cognitive issues, and depression are also linked to lack of sleep and overworking. And now, with 24/7 exposure to light with computers, we're really moving away from our natural cycles, and there is a cost. All right, so prominent physicians and media entrepreneurs are telling us that unplugging is a good thing. I'm pretty sure that this wisdom is a little older than that. I think I recall God passing on this wisdom to humanity at the end of the first week of creation before we even finished chapter 1 of Genesis. God recommends a Sabbath too. And I'd like to read a quote to you from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel from his book on the Sabbath about the sanctification and celebration of time. He writes, one of the most distinguished words in the Bible is the word kadosh, holy, a word which more than any other is representative of the mystery and majesty of the divine. Now, what was the first holy object in the history of the world? Was it a mountain? Was it an altar? It is indeed a unique occasion at which the distinguished word kadosh is used for the first time. In the book of Genesis, at the end of the story of creation, how extremely significant is the fact that it applied to time. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. There is no reference in the record of creation to any object in space that would be endowed with the quality of holiness. And this is a radical departure from accustomed religious thinking. The mythical mind would expect that after heaven and earth had been established, God would create a holy place, a holy mountain or spring whereupon a sanctuary could be established. Yet it seems as if, to the Bible, it is holiness in time, the Sabbath, that comes first. Well, what are we doing at Beth Torah to celebrate the Sabbath other than Shabbat services? We've started a new group called the Shabbat Celebrators, and these are folks for whom they want to engage in a time out on Shabbat, and they want to do that in community. It started with me inviting several people to my home who I had noticed were pretty serious about their Shabbat observance, not necessarily that they were Shomer Shabbat. Many of them drive, for example, but they feel dedicated to spiritual renewal on the Sabbath. So we gathered in my home, and I asked them to share with me what the joy of Shabbat was for them. What was a good Shabbat experience? One of them said, "Shabbat for me is not so much about abstaining from flipping light switches or exercising, or disconnecting from things like my phone and the internet and television. It is, however, a period of time where I give myself permission to slow down, ignore responsibilities of the work week that I prefer not to consider, and have a day where I do things mostly for myself. Shabbat is a time where I get to participate most fully in this culture and community I was born into, and when I get to be and feel a part of the living history that is the Jewish people." Another testimony: "When I think of the perfect Shabbat, I think of a meal that doesn't seem to end. Kids finish their food, and they go and play and come back to the table. The conversation meanders from topic to topic. The meal is done, but the dessert has not come out yet. And maybe there are dishes to do, and the conversation moves into the kitchen. If someone wants to sing, we sing. If someone wants to discuss the Parsha, we do that too. People are up for a walk in the neighborhood or a good board game, so we do that too. The key is feeling that there's no place anyone needs to go." There's a common thread in these two testimonials. One is allowing yourself to linger, to not feel pressed by the horror of headlines or the dread of deadlines, but to really allow yourself to relax and not feel obligated to answer an email from work or check your Facebook page or fulfill a social obligation that you don't want to fulfill. It's allowing yourself holiness in time. The other thing that these testimonials have in common is that they are done in community. It can be difficult to celebrate Shabbat alone. So let's say that you're inspired by this talk about creating a Shabbat practice for yourself, and you think, shul's not my thing, and I don't know many people at Beth Torah, so rather than test the waters and get involved, I'll develop a practice for myself at home. That's a good thing to do. And by the way, if you're an introvert, it's probably a necessary thing to do. A completely social Shabbat would be a miserable experience for you, and that's okay. However, play out this scenario with me. So you've determined I'm going to take Saturday off, but I know my boss said she would send me an email this weekend. I should really just check that one email. Well, gosh, that email had something important in it. Maybe I should just check the rest of them, and before you know it, without community around you to distract you and pull you into the joy of celebrating Shabbat, you spent the whole day working. Or you start Saturday morning with this determination to enjoy the day, and the first 3 hours are great. You make a luxurious cup of coffee, you get to read that book you've been meaning to read, you take the dog for a long walk, but then you find yourself starting to get a little bored and a little lonely. And you say, well, maybe half an hour of TV wouldn't hurt. That could be part of my Shabbat practice. And so you turn on the TV. And before you know it, you've got one screen with the game on and another with your Facebook page and a third giving you the news of the world in real time. And you're getting all flustered and overstimulated. Community is an important way to really dedicate yourself to the celebration of Shabbat. It's really hard to do alone. On a recent Shabbat afternoon, we decided to play board games in the Oneg room and do puzzles. And we sat with Trader Joe's snacks, and what I loved the most about it was that it was multi-generational. There were grandmothers teaching younger women how to play mahjong. There was a group of 20-somethings playing card games. The introverts of different ages had sat down with a jigsaw puzzle and were quietly working together in the corner. It was a beautiful sight to behold, and the group has discussed doing other things, like having a picnic in the park that's on the other side of the synagogue, and maybe playing frisbee or basketball there, or perhaps a Havdalah celebration in a member's home. So if you're interested in learning more about the Shabbat celebrators and helping us keep this group going, please come talk to me. I'd be happy to tell you more about it. That was point one, that the Sabbath is a good thing to celebrate because it can renew us in mind, body, and spirit. Now I'd like to shift to point two, which is that to celebrate the Sabbath is actually a form of resistance. I'll tell you a story that I found somewhat amusing. On Yom Kippur, there is a march scheduled for racial justice, and it's nationally organized. It's a big deal. When the Jewish leaders of human rights organizations found out that the march had been scheduled on Yom Kippur, they went to the leaders of the march and they said, "We're upset about this because we would really like the Jewish community to participate, and we feel excluded by your choice of date." The organizers of the march first responded with a sincere apology. They said, "We knew about the holiday of Yom Kippur, but we didn't understand how important it was to you, or that it might mean you would choose not to participate. Now we get it. Thank you for educating us. Unfortunately, we're not able to change the date of the march because it is the anniversary of a mass lynching in Arkansas that has significance to the Black community. But we want you to know something, Jewish community," and this tickled me. They said, "By keeping Yom Kippur sacred and in the tradition of your ancestors, we see that as a way of participating in the March for Racial Justice. Because by keeping those traditions, you're saying, I refuse to assimilate. I am proud of being Jewish and upholding my culture's traditions." Yom Kippur is not the only day when Jews have a custom to retreat from the everyday world. Shabbat is too. And it's a way of showing that this is important to each of us. I would add that it's important to invite your non-Jewish neighbors into your Shabbat celebration. There is a difference between inviting a neighbor over for a barbecue and inviting a neighbor over for a Shabbat dinner. Here are some of the underlying messages that could be read into a barbecue. I'm just like you. I'm American too. We're exactly the same. That's different from inviting someone to Shabbat dinner, which says, our values are just like your values. I enjoy being neighborly and having friends and family around me for a good meal, but I choose that value in an expression that is uniquely Jewish and has sustained my ancestors for thousands of years. And the reason to invite non-Jewish neighbors into our Shabbat celebrations, particularly if we think they don't know Judaism very well or haven't had much exposure, is it gives us an opportunity for conversation and education. So that's point two, that Shabbat is actually a form of resistance to anti-Semitism and a way of saying to those who think America should just be Christian that we disagree. Now I'll move to my third point, which is that pulling out of the world temporarily can be a good reminder that we're not in control of everything. We were having a Shabbat meal with a pastor and his family, and we had decided to take a walk in the park near our house. I was speaking to the pastor's wife and explaining that I refrained from technology on the Sabbath, and she was both fascinated and horrified. She and her husband, a big part of their church's mission is to be social activists and to organize. So for her, the idea of unplugging was a little overwhelming. She said, no text messages? No phone calls? No. You don't listen to the news? No. But how do you know what's happened? I said, look, it is important to know what's happening in the world around me, but the truth is, I'm not a first responder. There is nothing that I could do by knowing the bad news sooner that would be helpful. And it's true that bad things do happen on Shabbat. Charlottesville happened on Shabbat, and I didn't know about it until a few hours later. But there was still plenty of time for me to write an op-ed and to organize and attend a peace vigil, right? It can happen later. The poet Thomas Gray says, when ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. In other words, knowing the bad news sooner won't make the situation better. In fact, sometimes when I hear bad news and I have taken the time to replenish and center myself, I have a better response to the bad news, a more productive one than I might have if I met the news in my frazzled, overstimulated way. For me, some of celebrating Shabbat is about submitting and following God's commandments and realizing that I'm not all-powerful, that I can't stop everything bad in the world, and that God does not consider me solely responsible for repairing the world's troubles. That's actually part of why I don't drive on the Sabbath. It's a metaphor, right? I'm not at the driver's wheel, and it helps me remember my place in the world. I'll paraphrase Rabbi Dosa, who said, I'm not free to desist from the work, of course, but neither am I obligated to complete it alone. So I've made 3 arguments for why we should keep Shabbat. The first is that it replenishes mind, body, and spirit. The second is that it's a form of Jewish resistance. And the third is that it's a good reminder on putting perspective in the world of what we can and can't control. My hope is that each of us will find a way to celebrate the gift of Shabbat this year, to restore our strength, push back against hatred, and accept the fact that we are not all-powerful. I hope that you found something in part of this sermon that resonated with you about how to respond to our troubled times by using one of our oldest Jewish wisdoms, the Sabbath. And I look forward to sharing part 2 with you on Yom Kippur. May we all be blessed this year with celebrating Shabbat. Chag Sameach.